Hello, Jacksonites, and welcome to the grand finale of my Phantasm review series. I'm not going to beat around the bush. Today, we will be doing a double feature where we will be reviewing the two final Phantasm films. Phantasm 4 Oblivion, released in 1998, and Phantasm Ravager, released in 2016. And, of course, Trev will be joining me for this undertaking, I guess I'll say.
Howdy, everybody.
This is going to be a lot like my Resident Evil Retribution and Final Chapter review, where I think that the final film in the series is so bad that I don't really have any really much of anything to say about it that's positive. So I'm just gonna cram two reviews into one because I don't want to make a separate dedicated episode entirely to Phantasm Ravager. That kind of gives away my opinion on it, but I ain't got that much good to say about Phantasm Ravager. So yes, indeed, Phantasm 4 and 5 in one episode, and of course Trev will be joining me for this as well. So the structure of this episode may be a little bit all over the place. I'm going to be going through the plots of both Oblivion and Ravager one after the other, and then after that, Trev and I will go into our personal histories, and then we'll go to our pros and cons, however, which way we choose. Because I guess Trevor has a certain way that he wants to do it in his own way. So we're gonna hold off on the personal histories until then. So let's just dive right into the plots. Phantasm Oblivion begins where the previous film left off. Mike flees from Bolton Mortuary in a hearse, while Reggie is trapped inside by the Tall Man's spheres. However, rather than kill him, the Tall Man lets him go, saying the final game now begins. Mike's brother Jody, whom is still a black sphere that can occasionally resume his human form, contacts and persuades Reggie to search for Mike. And on the way, Reggie survives a demon attack, this demon being played by the guy who would go on to play Bubba Hotep.
Bob Ivy.
And rescues a woman named Jennifer from a car accident. They stay the night at an abandoned motel where Reggie tells her about the Tall Man. Jennifer is not who she seems to be, and she attacks Reggie with two spheres hidden inside of her tits. Okay. Reggie smashes Jennifer's head and one sphere with a sledgehammer and then uses a tuning fork on the other that manages to drill his hand into a wall. Mike tries to escape his transformation, driving through abandoned areas and recalling the last days of his youth before the Tall Man's arrival. This is the Phantasm film that really had the chainsaw taken to its budget. It went from a $2.5 million budget to a $650,000 budget for Phantasm 4. And because of this, Don Coscarelli decided that he wanted to morph the story around by including unused footage from the original Phantasm film, which I do admit is kind of clever, but it also does factor into one of my biggest cons with this film, which I will get into later. After being spooked by visions of the elderly fortune teller he consulted in Phantasm 1, the Tall Man appears and declares he is taking Mike somewhere to prepare for passage. This location is Death Valley, where Mike ultimately attempts suicide by hanging. However, the Tall Man interferes and shows him conflicting memories of when he and Jody attempted to kill the Tall Man back in 1978. Forbidden from taking his own life, Mike sees the Tall Man offer his hand, implying he wants to guide him. Refusing, Mike escapes through a dimension fork, and he appears to have traveled back in time, emerging from an early version of the Gateway in 1860s-era laboratory. He is greeted by a kind man named Jebediah Morningside, also played by Angus Scrimm, and Mike is frightened away because not only does Jebediah appear to be the tall man, but the fortune teller is also mysteriously present. In the desert, Mike realizes he is slowly developing telekinesis when he kills a dwarf with a large boulder. Jody finally appears, but a distrustful Mike accuses him of having abandoned him, and Mike begins working on the hearse's engine, seemingly using its parts to build himself a makeshift sphere. Mike goes through a gate and finds himself in a deserted city and escapes the tall man only with Jody's help. And while this is going on, Reggie arrives at Death Valley and fights off a group of dwarves shortly before Mike and Jody reappear through a gate. Mike embraces Reggie and tells him not to trust Jody, and then he just outright leaves, not even 2 minutes after seeing Reggie again. Mike and Jody pass through the gate and appear in Jebediah's house. Invisible to the old man, they witness how he perfects his craft and approaches the interdimensional gate. Mike unsuccessfully tries to grab the old man, who vanishes and moments later is replaced by the tall man incarnation who emerges in his place. He can see Jody and Mike, which forces Mike to retreat through the gate. Jody then finds Mike in a cemetery and attacks him. Awakening on an embalming slab, Mike uses the tuning fork to immobilize Jody and the tall man as they attempt to cut open his head with a buzzsaw-equipped sphere. He makes the tall man kill Jody with the still-running saw, and the tall man quickly revives and telekinetically takes the fork from Mike. Again, Mike escapes through the gate back to Death Valley, this time pursued by his nemesis. Reggie tries to shoot him, but is overpowered by the tall man, and Mike then summons the sphere he built and uses it to impale the tall man in the neck. And at this moment, Mike activates the hearse's motor, which turns out to be the true weapon, which is a strange interdimensional bomb against the tall man. The tall man is once again supposedly vanquished. However, a new tall man immediately comes through the gate, revealing that the tall man is but one of many. The tall man removes the golden sphere from Mike's head, which is not how a head would split apart to take out a ball, but whatever. And the tall man passes through the gate. Reggie arms himself and chases after the tall man through this gate, and then Mike recalls a childhood memory of him climbing into Reggie's ice cream truck as they both drive off into the night. Oddly enough, both of them hear each other's last exchange of dialogue from the present before Reggie went through the gate, and Reggie asks Mike if he hears the voice, but Mike brushes it off, saying, "It's just the wind." This then leads into Phantasm Ravager, 18 years in the making. The film begins with Reggie on foot in the desert, still on the trail of his nemesis, the tall man. Reggie is given a ride by a passing motorist who just happens to be driving Reggie's stolen car. He throws the man out, but two spheres suddenly fly by in CGI, and one sphere kills the man on the road while the other chases after Reggie in CGI. While defeating the spheres, Reggie seems to wake up in a hospital, much older, in a wheelchair, and is suffering from dementia. Why? Mike is with him, and he tells Mike his story. In an apparent dream setting, Reggie meets a woman who mistakes him for a friend. Her car isn't working, so Reggie offers her a lift. They go to a cabin on a farm, and Reggie learns that a Bulgarian man named Demeter helps out around the farm. Reggie explains to her about his dealings with the tall man over the years, and she is amazed by his tale. She tries his usual lady wooing, painfully, but is shot down, and as he plays a song, he cannot remember her name and then just goes to sleep. Later, the tall man shows up with more of his deadly spheres in a really piss-poorly hidden stunt double crow job. A flashback scene then shows Reggie in the hospital, but is the hospital from the 1860s. The tall man, or his original identity, Jebediah, is lying in the bed next to him, and they then talk. Jebediah explains he's nearly finished and has lost many friends. He says they are both there basically to die. However, he suddenly shifts to his tall man persona, and Reggie sees the lady in lavender, again played by Kathy Lester, physically conjoined to him, and the two warn him that he cannot escape from them. I'm always watching you. Reggie wakes up the next morning, remembering the lady's name to be Dawn. He gets no answer when he asks her a question and finds that she's been killed by spheres, and then give chase in CGI. Reggie equips himself with a shotgun, and the spheres force him into a nearby barn. A man armed with an axe confronts him, and it's revealed he is Demeter. A sphere kills a horse in really bad CGI blood. And another sphere then manages to get inside the barn, killing Demeter in CGI, before Reggie fights it off. Reggie speaks to Mike again in the hospital, and Mike tells him about a new threat that's looming. Back in his dream, Reggie goes through the woods, and along a path, he encounters a gigantic sphere hovering in the sky in CGI. And Reggie is back in the hospital again. Reggie alternates between the other world in both his dream and the present time. The tall man appears and says their paths cross again. It's 1979, and a younger self will attend a funeral in Morningside, and that all of his efforts got him nowhere. The tall man proclaims he can resurrect Reggie's dead family in exchange for him ceasing his meddling, which is honestly probably my favorite scene in the whole film. But anyway, Reggie is next seen in a mortuary contending with the dwarf lurker followers of the tall man, and the lady in lavender appears, once again played by Kathy Lester. She is shot by Reggie and seemingly killed. Continuing on, Reggie goes into a large cave, shooting a dwarf, and the place shakes. The tall man asks him if he's considered his offer, but when Reggie retaliates, the tall man again reminds him of his chances in depleting, and Reggie wants his friends Jody and Mike back. But the tall man recognizes his loyalty for his friends as foolishness. And yet another dream sequence, which he alternates from the nightmare world. Reggie is strapped to a gurney as armed masked people appear. One is called Chunk, an incredibly annoying dwarf, and the other is revealed to the person Reggie knew as Dawn, despite her death, but she says her name is actually Jane, and she thinks Reggie is delusional. She radios in some people, and Reggie fails to convince her that they know each other, but she gets him medical attention instead. More evil dwarves show up to attack Reggie, but Chunk saves him and gives him a weapon. Dawn and Chunk take Reggie to other members of their group who are fighting the tall man. Mike reunites with Reggie, again played by A. Michael Baldwin, I should have mentioned that before, and then escape the Nightmare Hospital. Mike tells Reggie he's been out of action for a decade in a coma, and the Earth has changed. He says it's no longer their home, it's the tall man's now. That's because from this point on, this movie pretty much takes elements from an unused script called Phantasm's End, written by a huge Phantasm fan, as he called himself, but was deemed too expensive by having a $10 million budget, which would have had Bruce Campbell as a co-star. But they pretty much just took elements from that script, gave that guy absolutely no credit whatsoever, and just used that to their advantage for this film. In the dream world, Reggie wanders around the hospital hallways, but a nurse orders him back to his room. In the nightmare world, an enemy has grabbed him, and a spiked sphere then kills one of the people helping Reggie. Mike visits Reggie at the hospital and says his dream orientates him. Mike reveals that he had a dream too, where he was in the desert looking for Reggie. It turns out Mike still has his connection to the tall man, and Mike reveals the tall man unleashed an alien virus that caused an apocalypse on society worldwide. That causes their heads to explode in CGI. Jane is caught by the tall man, so Chunk Chunk, Mike, and Reggie go after the Tall Man, and in his own Red Planet world, they face and badly ADR talk and kind of just stare awkwardly at the Tall Man. Jane is killed. Chunk, who posed as one of the dwarves, turns the tables and blows himself up to try to kill the Tall Man. Back at the hospital, Reggie fights some gravers alongside Mike. Jody shows up in a car spewing bullets to save them with Nerf guns strapped to the hood of his fucking Hamakuda. What the fuck? Oh my god, this movie is going to kill me. After driving a while, they decide to drive north as the Tall Man hates the cold. In a flashback to the hospital, however, Reggie seemingly passes away in bed while Mike and Jody are holding his hands as the film ends. However, during the end credits, Chunk appears through a portal along a desert road, somehow only missing a hand, and meets up with Rocky, played by the same actress. Chunk flirts with her, asking Rocky if he has a chance, and Rocky teases back, saying there are no other guys around. But then Rocky sees Reggie and the others pulling up in the Nerf gun-clad Barracuda heading north, and they get in. Lots of giant spheres are then shown in the sky in the distance, indicating the war with the Tall Man is far from over, thus ending seemingly the entire Phantasm franchise on a giant bullshit fuck you cliffhanger. Thanks a lot, guys. Love it. Trev.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, first, one thing, based on a little tidbit you said about the horse, I found out how they killed the horse, so to speak. Whenever they were filming that, there was a horse that would roll around on the ground if you sprayed water next to it. So actually, that is colored water. Still doesn't look great, but I just thought I'd point that out. So, my thoughts on the plots. I originally thought that Oblivion dragged quite a bit at the start. And like Nick, I thought that Ravager had a pretty unsatisfying cliffhanger. But this go around, basically my thoughts are how these two movies work together as the two halves of the finale for the series. So can I go into it?
By all means.
All right, everybody, this is kind of a preview of my writing. So if you've never read it, this will give you an idea. Oblivion and Ravager are the first and second halves of the Phantasm finale. Oblivion is Mike's final test to see whether he can face down death and realize he has control over it to an extent, but not fully. The Tall Man has always represented death, the Grim Reaper. It is his domain exclusively, but that doesn't mean Mike should fear it or him and surrender completely. Mike also questions the Jody sphere and rejects what it represents, the lingering grief over Jody's death. Reggie, too, is told the final game is about to begin and is given a chance to decline his call to action. First, when the Jody sphere tells him where to find Mike, and he attempts to refuse him. Then again, and what Nick mentioned was probably one of the best parts of Ravager, when the Tall Man offers to return Reggie's family to him in exchange for ceasing his pursuit of Mike. The Tall Man foreshadows the reveal of one of the realities in Ravager with his line from Oblivion to Reggie, "Ice Cream Man, all in his head." The multiple dimension forks, or space gateways, as Don Coscarelli calls them, on one hand show how the Tall Man will make his final invasion wave, but on the other hint at the multiple dimensions that Ravager suggests. Reggie's state of having dementia and his eventual death because of it refer back to the dictionary definitions used at the beginning of the Phantasm sequel trailers, the first being the delusion of a disordered mind. Reggie dying with Mike and Jody by his side is also the final emotional note on the series' theme of brotherhood. While it is not entirely satisfying in a traditional sense, the fight not really being over in Ravager ties itself back into the theme that Don Coscarelli was always exploring from day one in the original Phantasm, and that is the fight with death, which is never really conquered and ongoing. As the tall man said in Phantasm 3, it's never over. And these are some side things that I couldn't fit into that little thesis there. These are some Oblivion Pros. I really liked the photography, the desert photography, and there was one shot in particular that showed all the different dimension forks that I thought was pretty chilling. And I also like the use of the deleted Phantasm footage from the original movie, although it still makes me want to see that full 3-hour cut.
Yeah.
I also like how there's a use of another of the tall man's weaknesses in Oblivion, which is sound, as well as how that factors into the origins of his discovery. Whenever he was Jebediah Morningside, the Jody Sphere mentioned how his research involved the different fluctuations in warmth and cold and sound. Also, another pro, the last pro for Oblivion, is that the end song, Have You Seen It, by Reggie Bannister, is essentially a theme song for the franchise. And if you haven't heard it, Nick, I'll try and find it on YouTube and send you a link.
Okay.
It's a pretty good little rock song. And these are the lingering Oblivion cons that I had, which was there was a droning sound effect used in the score that really got on my nerves. It's that sound effect that's used like in desert sequences, or it's supposed to like imply a mirage. I've just heard it used in several other movies, and it kind of bugged me. That's kind of petty, and this is also petty. The lurker face effects in Oblivion look pretty bad. They're real stiff and mask-like.
Yeah, they pretty much do just look like a mask.
Yes. Okay, and then my Ravager Pros, aside from what I tried to mention in that little thesis, is that, in my opinion, because of how short it is, there's never really a dull moment. And I also liked all the Sentinel action, even though it was CGI.
In CGI?
Yeah. And Reggie and Tall Man's performances arguably are probably the best in the series. I think Tall Man's dialogue is very, I've used this word before, provocative, but there's some nice layers added to his performance in that we actually get to see him get frustrated for a change. And I also like that this is kind of a final curtain call for the series. There's something that touches on pretty much every moment from the other 4 movies right before it's over.
Except him.
And also next to Phantasm 2 score, this score is personally my second favorite out of all the movies. And finally, the one con with Ravager that really, really, really bugged me this time around is that I find the Chunk character very cringy. So yeah, that is all my thoughts on these 2 movies.
Hang on, I'm trying to get my damn pros and cons to load up. Oh, wait, hang on. What's your personal history?
Well, this is what made me want to watch all the movies. And probably one reason why, this is something that I always liked about Ravager, is that it's rare for a series that I'm just getting into to affect me emotionally. And even though it's probably quite a downer, I think that death of Reggie and also their reunion in the Cuda, I actually got choked up the first time I saw it, which was, again, that's rare for a series I'm just getting into to do. So that stayed with me.
Fair enough. Now, what were your first initial thoughts on Oblivion and Ravager, like when you very first saw them? like in terms of their quality?
Well, Oblivion always seemed to kind of drag for me. I felt always going back to the thing going on with Mike and the tall man, that just, for whatever reason, the pacing seemed kind of off with it. And it also felt kind of jarring that Reggie was kind of established as the lead by Phantasm 3, and then we flip back to Mike. But that kind of makes up for the fact that Mike was really absent in 3.
Mm-hmm.
But surprisingly, this time around, especially since I watched these back-to-back, that didn't really bother me anymore, oddly enough. And again, it's because I think of these as two halves of really one story. Unlike the first 3 movies, which are all pretty self-contained, I think that Oblivion and Ravager work in tandem with each other.
All right, so my pros for Phantasm 4. I'm going to get through the pros of both Phantasm 4 and Phantasm Ravager out of the way, and then I'll do the cons for both films after that. So pros for Phantasm Oblivion. The special effects are fairly decent, though except for they pretty much are just masks on the lurkers. Those don't look very, very good at all, but the special effects are decent. There is some more CGI used in this movie, and sometimes it looks cheap, like that shot of all those dimensional forks. It's a little chilling, yes, but the effects don't really work because it's very obvious it's just a big green screen. So that doesn't look all that great. But there's a shot where a shit ton of Sentinel spheres come flying out of the mausoleum and going off to God knows where. And I actually think that for a $650,000 budget in 1998, I think that looks pretty damn good. Maybe that's just,
so too.
Huh?
I thought so too.
That may just be me, or unlike just me and Trevor, but I thought that looked pretty good. And the makeup effects on the Bubba Hotep demon, they look pretty good, even though he looks pretty much just like a Cenobite in a police officer's uniform. That looked fine, and the actual police officer, like broken up and twisted around and tied in a pretzel knot in the police trunk's car. That looked good. That looked disturbing. But there's not that very much special effects in this film. And the couple explosions that we see look good too. But overall, the special effects are decent. They're not great. They're not terrible. But for what this film's budget is, it's not bad. Pro number 2 is this film, I think, is a good character study. This one is a lot more of a slower pace, which is both good and bad. And we're allowed more time to focus on Reggie and especially Mike. Mike, once again, takes center stage here. And I do believe that Mike gives his best performance of the entire Phantasm series in this film. He's got lots of good dialogue. He's got lots of good moments where he's just watching shit. And he says a lot with just his face. He goes throughout the movie a lot with just like this cold, stern expression on his face. And like when he's learning, he realizes he has telekinesis and he's learning how to use it. Like the look on his face when he kills a lurker with a boulder, you can clearly tell that he's like in awe, but at the same time, he's like, ooh, I like this. And the look on his face when his eyes turn silver and he tries to kill the tall man, the look on his face too says a lot. He's like, I finally got you, you motherfucker. And there's a lot of good stuff with Reggie in this movie too, even though it pretty much just is basic Phantasm, him killing demons and shit. It's still entertaining and it's still good. So overall, the character study aspect of this movie is really good too. And this leads me into pro number 3 is the exploration of the tall man's origins. We get a definitive answer. Well, not a definitive, but like we get a good amount of confirmation as to what the tall man is. He was once a man whose experiments eventually permanently transformed him into pretty much the embodiment of the Grim Reaper. that somehow uses brain-powered chrome balls with spikes and blades and drills and shit. But it's fascinating and it's well done and it's very minimalist, but at the same time, it's kind of like another less is more type thing. It speaks volumes. The next pro number 4 is the tall man himself. What? Trev?
No, I didn't say anything.
Oh.
I didn't say anything. Yeah.
The next pro that I have, pro number 4, is the tall man himself, of course, like duh. And whenever the tall man's on screen, this is great. But one aspect of the tall man that really stuck out to me in this film is he's kind of a smartass in this movie.
Yep.
Meaning, like, when Mike looks at him and says, "God damn you to hell. Not possible." Which, again, reminds me of Hellraiser, like in Hellraiser 3. Jesus Christ! Not quite. There's another line that I really liked that kind of made him a smartass. Fuck, what was it?
Was it the "be careful what you go look for, you might just find it"?
Well, there's that too, yeah. But there's another line that the tall man has where he's just kind of being a total smartass. Or it might just been this when Mike is trying to break his way out of the hearse and he realizes that the thing is on autopilot. Tall man just says, "The coach will drive itself." So yeah, the tall man is, of course, you can't take your eyes off him whenever he's on screen, and Angus Scrimm does give a good performance. Though this is kind of the last time that Angus Scrimm completely plays the tall man in a Phantasm film, and while it's not a bad final hurrah, I don't want to say like leaves something to be desired, because every single Phantasm film, when it comes to tall man screen time, leaves something to be desired. But I think it's especially notable here. In the next movie, it's understandable why, but I will still get into that when I get into Phantasm Ravager's cons. Pro number 5 is the action scenes are okay. There's not very much of them, and they're kind of over and done with really quick. I think probably my favorite scene is Reggie versus the Bubba Hotep demon. That's a pretty entertaining scene, and it's also a little bit funny because when there's a scene where Reggie like somehow traps this dude on top of a police car, and he cocks the shotgun because it's locked into like where it sits between the two seats. He cocks the shotgun and he still shoots it, and it goes through the Bubba Hotep demon. And then he like sticks his head out, and the demon just like goes and spits a whole bunch of yellow blood right into Reggie's mouth, which supposedly they had to redo that shot 6 times making this movie.
And they only used the first take.
I've always wondered, what the hell is that stuff? Is it like Cheese Whiz, or is it just yellow stuff?
I'm not sure. It seems a little too liquidy because Cheese Whiz is still kind of solid, but I don't know.
Who
Some
knows?
kind of goop.
Anyway, so yeah, the action scenes are okay. Again, there's not that much of them, but they're still entertaining for what they are. And pro number 6 is the idea of reusing Phantasm 1 footage. I am more like the ingenuity behind that aspect of this movie. Like, it shows that Don Coscarelli knows how to utilize untapped resources. So I do think that is really clever that he's going back and reusing unused resources in order to make a future project. I think that's really cool, and I think that's really inventive. Though that kind of has a double-edged sword, but I'll get to that in just a little bit. And that's everything. That's all the pros I have for Oblivion. My pros that I have for Phantasm Ravager, pro number 1 is Reggie himself. I think Reggie Bannister gives his best performance of the entire Phantasm franchise in Phantasm Ravager. none of his well, some of his dialogue's kind of cringy, but I think you can just take that for what it is. But when he's really trying to be serious and more,
line was terrible.
huh?
Oh, I just said the horse line was terrible. Dude, sorry about your horse.
Yeah, that was kind of cringy. And it's like, okay, Captain Obvious, and also him trying to persuade Jane that he remembers her as Dawn. Like I'm singing this stupid ass rock song. Do 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 do. Ugh. Other than that, though, Reggie really gives a good performance in this film, and he conveys being. This is the one good thing I will say about the nursing home sequences that he really tries to convey somebody with dementia that's trying to convince the person they're talking to that their delusions are real. So that's all well and good, but overall, Reggie, I really do think gives the best performance of the entire series. I think you could almost say like he's the highlight of the entire film.
Absolutely.
Pro number this kind of goes into pro number 2, but I'll just say the first 10 minutes of this movie are very fucking fun. It gets the Phantasm car chase completely out of the way right then and there, which Phantasm Oblivion doesn't really have a car chase now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Which is a shame. But this probably might be my favorite car chase of the entire series, honestly, because of how it gets started. Reggie comes across his car, sees this jackass who was also in Bubba Hotep driving it, says, "Can I get a lift to the next town? You got money?" "Sure. $50. Sure." Gets in the car. "Give me that $50. Here. This is a nice car. Kind of looks like my own 71 Cuda. Some asshole stole mine. Of course, mine had a chrome-plated 9mm with chrome-plated wad cutters loaded in the center console." Opens up the center console. Huh. Thunk. "Oh yeah, I was in the glove box. Get the fuck out of my car." Badass. Not gonna lie. I was laughing my ass off when I first saw this movie at that scene. I was like, okay, that's cool. That's how you start off a movie.
I fucking love it.
And it just goes downhill from there. No, not really. So yeah, the first 10 minutes of this movie I think are pretty damn stellar. Pro number 3 is The Passion. Now, this is the only Phantasm film to not be directed by Don Coscarelli. This film was directed by David Hartman, who is a self-proclaimed Phantasm fan. And you can very much tell that David Hartman's mind and heart were in the right place by including all the Easter eggs and the fan service and the fan-friendly elements of this movie to make it as much of a Phantasm film as possible. So the passion is there, and I do admire this film for that. Pro number 4 is, once again, The Tall Man. The Tall Man gives some of my favorite lines of the entire series. And I think despite this film being the shortest of the entire franchise, I think The Tall Man speaks the most dialogue of the entire series as well. There's lots of really, really good Tall Man dialogue in this movie that's totally captivating and still shows that despite Angus Scrimm being in his late 80s, he still knows how to be incredibly menacing as the Tall Man. So that's cool. And that's it for pros for both films. I have 6 for Oblivion and 4 for Ravager. What?
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's get to the cons. For a Phantasm Oblivion, con number 1, this movie looks cheap. This movie, in terms of, despite being almost 20 years apart, this movie manages to look as cheap as the first Phantasm film in a 90s way.
Yep.
Like there's very little set shooting. It's almost like 90% of all of the sets in this movie is location shooting, because a lot of this movie is shot in the desert, and that's really, really cheap. You don't really need to get a film permit to go out in the desert and shoot a movie. Which again is once again utilization of this movie's budget in a good way, but still it screams cheap. Like, there's not very much production value. There's not very many special effects. There's not very many action scenes. It's just all character driven, which again isn't bad, but it still does scream cheap. And this also goes into con number 2. This movie's got a lot of stock footage, not just of the first Phantasm, but of the previous Phantasm films as a whole. And now, not even talking about just like the Rocky style recap at the very beginning of the film. There's a lot of stock footage sprinkled out through the entire movie from previous Phantasm films. And again, that to me just kind of screams of this movie being cheap. I wouldn't be surprised if there was barely an hour's worth of new footage shot for this film. Kind of like with Gamera versus Virus. So this movie is exactly 90 minutes long. And I'd be willing to say that, yeah, almost a third of this movie is stock footage, which is kind of frustrating, especially for somebody who is a big Phantasm fan. It just gets really old to watch footage that I just watched from the previous 3 films. Con number 3 is the lack of action. Again, this all ties in this movie being really cheap. There's not really that much action. What we do have is okay, but it still leaves a lot to be desired, and it leads to this movie being pretty slow. And that's my next con is 1, 2, 3. Con number 4 is this movie is pretty slow. I will once again quote Phantasm 1 in saying that I think the first act of this movie is the most hard to sit through. It does pick up in Act 2 and especially 3 when things really start to pick up and it becomes the Phantasm twist shit. That's when it gets a little more entertaining. But still, the first act of this movie is pretty difficult to sit through, and it leads to this movie really not being, once again, very rewatchable, just like Phantasm 1. Con number 5 is I think this movie has the weakest score of the entire series, in my opinion. Kind of like without Phantasm 3 is Trevor's least favorite. This one is my least favorite. This one just feels very, very generic. This is definitely the most generic Phantasm score of the entire series. Like, at least with Huh?
Yeah, let me amend that. I will actually agree that this is probably my least favorite score, and right above it is 3's.
At least with Phantasm 3, the score did fit what was going on screen because it was generic music, but it was generic action movie music. Here, it's just generic. 90% of the time, except for the few times that the Phantasm theme itself is playing, you don't even notice the music. And also, half the time, there really isn't any music that's played. Like during the entire fight with Reggie versus Bubba Hotep, there's very little, if not any, music at all. So yeah, I do think this movie has the weakest score of the entire series, which is kind of disappointing. And my last con number 6, is the cliffhanger ending. Now, it's not nearly as bad as any other bullshit cliffhanger endings that I can think of off the top of my head. And Trev does kind of give me a little bit more insight to this movie's ending. And yeah, I can see these movies as being like a 2-part finale to the series. So the cliffhanger ending makes a little bit of sense. And if you like, similar to how Phantasm 2 and 3 go together very well, Phantasm 4 and 5 go together very well too. But still, it's very frustrating because, again, especially through the mindset of somebody who is not aware of Phantasm 5, the ending to this movie seems like one of those really contrived bullshit, I am lazy cliffhanger endings. Like, you could just make it up for what it is. It's not like Inception. I'm not a fan of that film, but that movie was meticulously planned out to have its ending be Does the top fall or does it not fall? Is it a dream or is it not a dream? You watch the movie and you make up your own mind. With this, it just feels lazy. Now, thankfully, it's kind of softened because of the next movie, but because of all that movie's problems, that almost kind of rectifies that statement as well.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get into the cons of Phantasm Ravager. Cody Leach, if you ever watch this, take a listen, because a lot of that shit you say, I agree with. Con number one is the special effects in this movie overall are pretty fucking terrible. All of the CG is pretty damn bad. The Crow take Angus Scrimm's face and digitally insert it onto a stunt double effects look really bad. Really, 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 really bad. It legitimately, like, no bullshit. Like, when Reggie is at Dawn's farm and you see the tall man in the shadows, it literally looks like a cardboard cutout of Angus Scrimm digitally raising his eyebrow. And you can clearly tell they tried so hard to hide the fact that it was not Angus Scrimm, but it was a Crow job of Angus Scrimm. But it's because most of his face is in shadow. All you see is his eyes. But you can still clearly tell that but it is not Angus Scrimm. And it looks awful. The colored water effect with the horse also looks really bad. The CG spheres and spiked balls all look so fake and so cheap. All the news footage showcasing the tall man taking over the world with the CG balls shooting lasers all look terrible. All the CG muzzle flashes and CG blood splatters look really bad. All of the green screen and composite shots look terrible. To quote Andy the Maniacal Cinephile, this looks like a fan film you'd find on YouTube or a Sci-Fi Channel movie. Because this movie actually kind of was a web series at first, but it was later compiled into a film. Released theatrically. And miraculously, I did manage to find exactly how much this movie did cost, and it was the same as the original, about $300,000. And my guess was that at the very minimum it was about 200,000, and at the max was 4. So I guess 3 is a good middle point. But damn, this movie doesn't even look like $300,000. Supposedly, actually no, Hellraiser Revelations did cost $300,000. But even somehow Hellraiser Revelations looks better than Phantasm Ravager. So what the fuck?
Less CGI for sure.
True. Very true. Yeah, there's that. So actually, I just talked about like con number 1 and 2 is the bad special effects and the bad CG. Those two go hand in hand, but that's still 1 and 2. There's very little to no practical effects in this movie, and they all look terrible. And the CGI just speaks for itself. It all looks bad. Con number 3 is, except for Reggie and the tall man and to some extent A. Michael Baldwin, the rest of the acting in this movie is horrendous. It's not even like Phantasm level bad, where that's an indie production where everybody there, it was their first time, so they were kind of wet behind the ears. It was still bad, but at least it was explainable. Here, it's just bad. It's cringe bad. It's pain bad. It's facepalm inducing bad. There's no line delivery that is delivered normally. It's either over the top or incredibly badly subdued. And it's just cringeworthy as fuck to sit through. Excuse me. Con number 4 is the pacing. I think this movie is paced all over the place. There's some parts that fly by like 100 miles an hour, and there's some parts that just drag like nobody's business. And I'm specifically talking about con number 5 is the nursing home segments. Now, I'll admit, I could kind of get behind this movie if it didn't have the nursing home segments. But whenever it went to the nursing home, it brought the pace to a complete screeching halt. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, I don't care about this shit. The only one that I can kind of get behind is when Reggie's back in the 1860s and they see Kathy Lester conjoined with the tall man. That one's fine because we get to see a little bit more of Jebediah Morningside. Also, Angus Scrimm playing the tall man, which also apparently was the last scene to be shot for this movie. Also, the last scene to be shot showing Angus Scrimm in action. So that's kind of cool. But other than that, all of the nursing home segments completely kill this movie. It brings the pace to a screeching halt. It muddles the story even further. Reggie dying at a fucking dementia is a slap in the face as far as I'm concerned. Like, what the actual fuck? Everything other than the nursing home segments is fine in terms of pace, but it's really the nursing home segments that kill this movie's pace for me. Con number, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 is the frustrating storytelling. This kind of reminds me of an anime movie directed by Satoshi Kon called Perfect Blue. That's another movie where there's a lot of blurred reality type subject matter where the main character is suffering from delusions and hallucinating because she's being stalked by her psycho manager. And there's a lot of scenes where she'll spend 10 to 15 minutes in one scenario and then she'll wake up. And then spend another 10 to 15 minutes in this scenario, then she'll wake up. So on and so forth, like 5 or 6 times throughout the film. Here it's the exact same way. Whenever Reggie wakes up from something like, it gets incredibly draining watching that so many fucking times throughout this movie. I'm just screaming at the movie, pick a setting and stick with it. Please. Yeah, I don't like this movie's storytelling. This type of storytelling, I think, only works when you have a seasoned and experienced director working on it. Going back to Satoshi Kon, Perfect Blue, in my opinion, doesn't work with that storytelling because Satoshi Kon liked to work with that type of subject matter in his own movies, that he would write them out himself. Perfect Blue was the only one of Satoshi Kon's movies that he directed, but it didn't write, or he didn't write it. And it was also an adaptation of a novel. So trying to force already existing subject matter into something that is completely different from what the original source material was trying to convey just doesn't work, which is why anybody who's a big fan of Perfect Blue out there, I'm just going to tell you right now, Satoshi Kon should not have directed that movie whatsoever. Now, to talk about a movie that Satoshi Kon did do where that type of thing does work is the anime film Paprika. That also does a lot with blurring the lines between dream and reality and lots of waking up from dream sequences and dream this and dream that. In that film, it works because not only did Satoshi Kon direct it, it was not based on a book, but he also wrote it, so he had the time to work out all the details and give it his own Satoshi Kon flair. With Perfect Blue, it doesn't work, but with Paprika, it does work. And in this film, in my opinion, it doesn't work because this also bleeds into one of my biggest problems with this movie. Con number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is the lack of Don Coscarelli's direction. Now, if Don Coscarelli really did want to make this movie this exact way, I think he would have been a much better director to convey this type of storytelling, because I just don't, because the only things that David Hartman worked on before Phantasm Ravager was My Friends Tigger and Pooh. No, sorry, David Hartman. You should not have directed this movie. I appreciate that you're a fan, and I appreciate that you tried to make this movie as fan-friendly as possible, but you just weren't the guy for the job. Not for this kind of storytelling. I think Don Coscarelli would have been much better at that. So, Don, why didn't you direct this movie? Con number 9 is the lack of tall man. Now, this one is a little bit understandable because Angus Scrimm was in his late 80s at the time of this movie being made, so it's understandable that Angus Scrimm passed away of prostate cancer, and this movie is actually released after his death. So he sure had to have been fighting prostate cancer, like going through chemo and all that kind of shit, despite the fact he was still doing this movie. So there's not that much of actual Angus Scrimm in this film. I actually think there's really only 3 scenes where Angus Scrimm is just standing there dressed as the tall man. There's Reggie meeting with the tall man in that white room a few minutes later, after Reggie kills the lady in lavender, and then on the tall man's red planet. I think those are the only scenes where it's actually Angus Scrimm standing there playing the tall man. Every other tall man scene is a man with a crow job Angus Scrimm face on his face. Now, again, tall man, or Angus Scrimm, does still play the tall man very well, and we get very good tall man lines, but I still do feel like, because of how big this movie is trying to be, and the chaos and the post-apocalyptic type scenario that this movie's trying to convey, it kind of does suffer from the lack of its leader, that of course being the tall man. He's not on screen very much, and that kind of hurts the severity of the threat in this movie. And the final con number 10 for Phantasm Ravager, is the ending. Now, again, Trev does kind of explain it well, of saying like this could be just an embodiment of death, how death is never truly conquered. That's all well and good, but still, it's another bullshit cliffhanger ending where the filmmakers just could not make up their mind on, do we really want to give this a definitive ending, or do we want to just leave it on a cliffhanger and maybe make a sequel 18 years again down the road with the tall man recast and Reggie and Mike also recast, possibly. Again, it kind of reminds me of Gamera 3's ending, where you can kind of take that as face value as the ending of the series, or you could take it as just a cliffhanger and await a 4th or 5th or 6th film in the series, but then just set yourself up for disappointment and it never happened. Though with Gamera 3, it's somewhat rectified because of the existence of the fan-made 4th Gamera film, Gamera Truth, but to our knowledge, nothing really Phantasm-related has been announced ever since Phantasm Ravager. I still say Don Coscarelli should direct at least one more Phantasm film to make up for this movie's being a lack of a satisfactory ending, because that's another issue that this movie feels like. It doesn't feel like the end of the series. It just feels like the end of another Phantasm film. So it doesn't feel satisfactory in a way of ending the franchise. It just feels like another cliffhanger for us to await yet another Phantasm film, which more than likely will not come. I hate this movie's ending. I hate it so much. It just brings my piss to a boil every time I watch it. It's just like Gamera 3 and Attack on Titan and Shin Gojira. I hate this movie's ending with a burning passion.
Gamera actually bothers me more, to be honest.
And I have some boring-ass water here.
Hey, it's good for you.
Any final thoughts, Trev?
Well, we've mentioned Bubba Hotep a lot. I want to also add to that also the actress who played Jennifer in Oblivion was also in Bubba Hotep. A nurse in Ravager was also in Bubba Hotep, and so was one of the patients there, the old guy who stares at Reggie real awkwardly.
Go figure.
But my final thoughts. I'm actually really glad we did this review series because I've gained a new appreciation for a lot of these movies. I've actually seen these two the most now, surprisingly. And I'm hoping the first three will eventually catch up. I think Nick made a lot of really great points, but I think what I'd like about these movies outweigh those for me. But that's just how I look at things. I try to focus on the good. And I also recommend for anybody who's listening to these and hasn't seen them, after you've seen these movies, I recommend watching them all with the commentaries because they're quite fun and also informative. What was that?
See, I need to do that myself, but that's not going to be for a little while.
Yeah, I actually learned Angus Scrimm, who in real life was very much like the Jebediah Morningside personality.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
A very sweet man. He revealed on the Phantasm 3 commentary, which is him and A. Michael Baldwin, he revealed that most of the movies take place in Oregon or along the West Coast. And, and I think one more thought is that, should we do the ratings or you want to wait?
Well, we'll wait till we get our final thoughts out the way.
Yeah, but I think you made some good points. I think really this franchise is definitely a mixed bag for most people. You have ones that you really like and then ones that you don't. So, yeah, I think that describes it pretty well.
So my final thoughts on Oblivion and Ravager. Oblivion is once again kind of a mixed bag, but it does lean more towards being negative, and it once again showcases that the three biggest problems that plague this entire franchise being the lack of tall man, them being too short, and also the lack of budget. The lack of budget is really this franchise's biggest problem. But Oblivion is not terrible, but it's not great either. I'd be shocked if somebody came out to me and said that this was their favorite in the franchise.
They're out, surprisingly.
And as for Phantasm Ravager, I went into this movie knowing all of the shit about this movie because, like I said, Phantasm Ravager was kind of the film that made me aware of Phantasm. So, I heard all the production issues. I heard about it being cheap and it being in all over the place in production value and story and narrative and plot and its production values and all this kind of shit. So I knew all of this stuff going in, and I knew that it probably would not be a satisfactory conclusion to the series. But I'm going to tell you right now, both times that I watched this movie, when it was over, I turned over and looked at my wife, and I just said, that sucked. Now, I don't find it to be nearly as insulting as, like, say, Cody Leach, for example, who described in his first review of Phantasm Ravager, described it as unacceptable. Now, I'm not that offended by this movie, and I'm not that insulted by this movie, because I knew all this shit going in, but I still am very disappointed in this movie, and I do think that it is a very unsatisfying finale to... I so want to badly call this one of my favorite horror movie franchises. I want to, but because it's such a mixed bag, I can't in good conscience. Phantasm Oblivion, I will be giving a 6.5 out of 10. Again, it's not bad, but it's not great. And Phantasm Ravager, I will be giving a 4 out of 10. And if anybody's expecting us to do a ranking the Phantasm franchise video, that's just not going to happen. This franchise is too short. So I'll just get mine out of the way real quick. At the very bottom, of course, is Phantasm Ravager. And right below that, I hate to say it, is the first Phantasm. Just because I want to see the 3-hour cut. If I saw the 3-hour cut, I might say it's better than both Oblivion and Ravager. But it's not, so I don't. Then below that is Phantasm Oblivion. And then, mostly just due to default, is Phantasm 2. And then my absolute favorite being, of course, Phantasm 3. Trev, ratings and ranking.
Okay, seeing how my rating for the first movie was a 7, I do believe. Oblivion is going to be a 6, because on its own, I do think it is below the first movie, in my opinion. Ravager, this is probably going to make Nick have an aneurysm or something. I will give it an 8, just for me personally. And as for my rankings, number 1 is Phantasm 2. Number 2, number 2 is Ravager, because what I really liked about this movie won it over for me. Number 3 is Lord of the Dead, or Phantasm 3. Number 4 is the original Phantasm, and number 5 is Oblivion. He may not recover, folks. There we go. That's better.
Oh my God, an 8?
Yeah, it's because I've watched it so much recently, man. I guess I've just accepted it for what it is, and I'm okay with it. I've made peace with it.
Well, before we leave, I do want to give my final thoughts on the entire Phantasm franchise as a whole. It's very ingenious. It's very ingenious. It's very it's a mixed bag. Kind of like with The Walking Dead. It is a big mixed bag. At its highest, it's very ingenious, it's very imaginative, and it's very entertaining and fun and thought-provoking and chilling. At its worst, it's cheap, bad, dull, bad acting, and just has endings that make you want to pull your hair out of your head. I still do think that this is one of those franchises that really would benefit from a remake, which is why my concept of a Phantasm remake is not a movie, but a TV series done in a similar way to Ash vs. Evil Dead. You kind of have the tone of Phantasm 3 with it being a road series. Like each episode, Reg and Mike go from town to town to town, and they are kind of hot on the tall man's heels. And they, like, at the end of every episode, they almost have a confrontation with him, or they have like a small confrontation with him. But as the series goes on, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then they encounter more of the tall man's minions, like if they discover the lurkers or super lurkers or gravers and zombies and demons and shit that the tall man creates. And of course, a lot more various forms of the sentinel spheres. But of course, keeps the language, it keeps the gore, and it keeps the ambiguous and mindfuck tone of Phantasm 1, 2, and 3. Basically, the series I would want to see to be reimagined as kind of a hodgepodge, in a good way, of the first 3 Phantasm films, of all their best elements. Now, obviously, that would be very difficult because who the hell else are they going to find to play the tall man in that show? But also, the tall man just never really reached the same kind of mainstream appeal as something like The Evil Dead. Like, I was amazed that The Evil Dead managed to get its own TV series. And I'm amazed that Hellraiser, supposedly it's getting its own TV series. Same for Chucky. So I really think Phantasm would benefit best from a remake of itself in the form of a TV show. And don't make it a long TV series. Just make it like 3 or 4 seasons, with each season being 10 episodes or so, maybe even 12. So that's how I really do think Phantasm should be reimagined. And in the overall general scope of entire horror movie franchises that I have seen, like I said, I want to call this one of my favorites, but the bad aspects of it really do keep me from calling it one of my favorites and a true classic. It's just an embodiment of the phrase, what could have been would have been way better. Trev?
I'm actually really down for what Nick just suggested, because I think that's probably the best future for the franchise. But my description of Phantasm is that I consider it a midway point between the homegrown, down-to-earth, and kind of quirky Tremors franchise and the more existential mindfuckery that you find in the Hellraiser movies. I think it's a midway point between those.
One more thing,
Tremors
too.
is probably the best of those 3. So
yes, do not try to connect. If that Phantasm TV show was to ever be made, my only thing is that I would really hope that the creators not try to connect it to the movies, because that would just be a giant clusterfuck.
Yeah, it needs to be a reboot.
Yes, absolutely. With some actual money poured into this, and smart writers and directors poured into this.
Nicolas Cage is the tall man, everybody.
Abso-fucking-goddamn-lutely. Nicolas Cage as the tall man would be spectacular.
Do it, boy.
So with that all being said, post your comments down below and let me know what you think. Hit the like button and hit the subscribe button, and share this video with your friends. Go out and watch the Phantasm franchise. Despite all this movie's faults, I still recommend it for you to check out. When it's good, it's stellar. But when it's bad, it's insufferable. And once again, I still would like to dedicate this entire franchise's reviewing to Eric Harrison from the Death Twitch Horror Review and Cody Leach from Cody Leach. Trev, you got anything to plug?
Well, I need to check this out. I do believe the site is down currently, but the last week of Kongtober is going on the Fictosphere, and we are considering next month doing a theme that covers the Universal monsters, potentially. But that's TBD. It's in consideration.
Okay. So look forward to my next video. I'm not really sure what it's going to be, but I'll try to make it as exciting as possible. And I will see all of you guys in the next video. And go check out the Fictosphere, because that sounds fun.